Hi everybody, welcome back. It's Watercolour Wednesday again with me, Rebecca Jarman. Thank you for joining me. I'm grateful that you're here. Today I'm going to teach you 4 interesting techniques to create texture in your watercolour painting. So it's one of my Back to Basics series. So this is what I'm going to be showing you today. And stick with me till the end of the video where I give you 4 tips on how to create this successfully in your painting. So what I'll be using during today's video is some table salt, a little bit of coarse crystal sea salt as well, some cotton thread. I've got dark cotton thread so that you can see it clearly on the screen, bubble wrap and some cling film, or if you're in America I think you call it plastic wrap. So let's get started. So I'm going to begin firstly by showing you the salt resist technique, and I've got my number 8 brush. It's slightly damp. I've already prepared my paint. I've mixed up some ultramarine blue quite thickly. This one is burnt sienna, Payne's grey and some crimson as well. Those are the darker colours I want to use to show you the technique clearly on the screen. So I'm just popping down some of that ultramarine blue that I've mixed. The paint needs to be damp when you apply the salt. So there we go with the ultramarine blue. Might actually add in a little stronger colour. So just gone into my palette there and strengthen that up a little bit. You can see that it's wet on the surface, and I have a little bit in this pink container, a little bit of the granulated salt, table salt. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit at the top, leaving some gaps between each of the granules. I've only sprinkled a little bit. You should be able to see on the screen where it's looking dark. That's where the salt's landed on the paint. And in here I have some of the crystalled salt. So this is like sea salt, the coarse crystals, you can see there. So I can place these down into the paint in the bottom section. I'm going to leave some gaps. Let's pop a couple more on there. And the way this technique works is that the paint needs to be wet. When you place the salt down, the salt starts to absorb and suck the paint up. And once the area is completely dry and we remove the salt, you'll see the lovely texture that it creates. So in the next square on my paper, I'm going to show you what to do with some cling film or plastic wrap. So I've taken a small section of cling film here, ready. So you need to have that prepared before you apply your paint, because again it needs to be applied onto wet paint. So I'm going to go into my burnt sienna, do exactly the same as I did before, just wetting the area and applying the paint. And hopefully this is going to be dark enough. I'm going to go back into my paint on my palette there and just darken it up a little bit. With some thicker paint. So this is burnt sienna. So I've not been too careful how I've applied it there, but now while it's wet I'm going to lift up my cling film and scrunch it a little, and I'm going to place it down on top of the paint and actually press it into the surface of the wet paint. Press down quite firm so that the cling film doesn't move about, and you can already see that there are some shapes being created there. So just a quick pause to remind you, in case you missed last week's episode, episode 4 was all about brush control, and these are the different techniques I showed you in last week's episode. And there are obviously, this is episode 5 now, so there are 4 previous episodes to view. If you've not caught any of those, I'll pop the link down below this video so you can check those out. And also, if you're gaining an insight and learning something from my video today, it'd be really great if you could give me a thumbs up, a like the video, and also subscribe if you'd like to learn more techniques from me, and click the bell icon too, and that way you'll get notified every single time I upload a beginner video. So let's get back to today's episode. So technique number 3 is we're going to be using this bubble wrap, and again I've prepared a small section ready to go, because again this technique needs to be applied to wet paint. So actually I'm just going to wet the area with a little bit of water first to make sure that this is damp, and then I'm going to use my crimson this time. You can see how it wants to splay in that water. It's beautiful, isn't it? Love the way it reacts with the water, wet in wet. Beautiful technique. Okay, so I've got lots of paint down. I'm going to make sure there's absolutely plenty down, and again just strengthen up. Let's go stronger in this top section with some paint straight from the palette, so it's a little bit darker up there, a little bit thicker paint. And now while that's really wet, I'm going to take my bubble wrap, but I want to make sure that the bubble side is facing down, and I'm going to press that into the wet paint, just like I did with the cling film in the previous section. But now what I need to do is find something to apply a little bit of pressure while it's drying, so I'll do that now. So I found a nice stone which is going to apply constant pressure while that paint is drying. Clean off my brush, and then the final technique I want to show you is using the cotton thread. So I'm going to need to take some lengths of cotton thread. I'll just go and grab some scissors and cut some pieces up. So I've just found a pair of scissors and I've cut a long length of the cotton thread, and I've also got some short lengths down here which I'm going to try and create a pattern with. So the same thing again, we have to have wet paint for this technique to work. So I'm just going to take my water, it's slightly dirty but that doesn't matter, just to wet an area, and this time I'm going to use Payne's Grey. So I've already mixed it up in the palette. Place it down on there. Let's get some stronger grey. Do slightly stronger paint there. The top. Okay, so that should be fine. Now what I'm going to do is with the longer piece, I'm just going to let it drop sort of in a natural kind of random pattern, sort of spirally. And what I'm going to do now is let's take my clean brush. I'm just going to press that into the paint, because what happens is obviously as you lay it down, it's very, very lightweight cotton thread, and it doesn't necessarily want to lay flat on the surface. So if you just encourage it to sit down in the paint, it starts to soak up the wet paint to create a texture. So just pressing it in there. I might actually just pop down a little bit of paint as well. So I'm just laying down some paint off my bristles onto that to make sure it's nice and wet. I suppose you could dip your thread sort of in the paint, in a little pot of paint before you lay it down. That's an option, but I prefer to do it like this and control it with a brush. And then these smaller threads, I'm going to try and create a more sort of consistent line pattern, so some parallel lines, I think. Let's have a go with that. So just placing it down and then sort of moving it, manipulating it a little bit with the paintbrush down into that wet paint. And let's do some verticals now. I'm going to wet my brush, and because this is lying over the top of the previous cotton, it really does need encouraging to lay flat, so that extra paint on my brush helps to push it down to the surface. And I'll do the same again with this one. Let's get it to lay down. So more paint on my brush. I'm just using the tip of the bristles to encourage that to lay down flat. And what's happening is that paint that's on my brush is being soaked up by the cotton, so it's making the cotton heavier, and it's allowing it to lay on the surface. And now what we have to do is allow all of this to dry and come back in a few minutes and show you the results. Welcome back. So as you can see, I've let them completely dry and I've removed all the different elements from the surface of the paper. So in the top left we've got the salt technique. So the granulated table salt actually created the best effect. There's just some little spots where you can see the larger crystals were, but they're not as effective. It might have been because there was a little bit less paint down the bottom area. If you remember, I applied extra paint to the top, so that could be a possible reason. It could have started to dry and it was possibly not wet enough for that. And then second area here, we have the cling film resist technique, which has created a lot of beautiful texture on the surface, and some really unusual shapes there that you could never paint with a paintbrush. The third technique here was with the bubble wrap, and you can see there's some lovely shapes, organic kind of, obviously circular shapes, which you'd expect. Again, there's a better result at the top where I applied more paint, a thicker paint to the top, and in the bottom here, if I turn it a little bit, it's a lot more subtle in this area. And finally, the technique with the cotton thread has worked really nicely, and because I've used Payne's Grey, it's sort of split on the surface. It's a granulated paint, so you can see that the thread's actually looking quite blue in that grey. But if I show you my palette, the paint has, like I say, it's split, it granulates, and you can see that there's a very blue section of that Payne's Grey area, and that's effectively what has happened on the surface of the paper there. So firstly, you want to make sure that the colour you use is saturated or dark. So you're going to actually create a much more visual effect, quite striking the darker the colour and the thicker the pigment you use. So that's a really good tip. Also, you've got to make sure that that paint on the surface of the paper is still wet when you apply these different mediums to it. And thirdly, please allow it to dry completely. Don't get impatient and start removing things from the surface, like the cotton or the bubble wrap. Don't try pulling it away while it's still wet. The technique will not work unless it's completely dried. And finally, we're all a little bit impatient, but if you let them dry naturally, don't think about bringing across a hairdryer just to speed things up. It won't work, guys. Okay, what will happen is, especially on the plastic wrap and the bubble wrap as well, what will happen is it will just lift the plastic from the surface of the paper and you won't get any kind of texture left behind. So just be patient, allow it to completely dry, and then you'll find that you'll have much more success with these different techniques. So thanks very much for joining me today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. Just to let you know that next week's episode is all about how I transfer my reference image onto watercolour paper. So that's episode 6 in my Back to Basics series. I hope to see you then.